Jeff, let me bring you into this discussion. You are a scholar of comparative religions, history of religions. Is a spiritual perspective, a religious perspective, fundamental in how people approach the thought of dying?
Well, I think it is. Yeah, I mean, it's richer than that, though. I mean, the consensus, well, one consensus among the scholarly community is that a lot of religious beliefs actually probably originated around death. In other words, very strange things happen around a human death, a lot of extraordinary things, and that these then generate really basic religious ideas like a separable soul. In other words, there's something about the human being that is not the ego, is not the cultural or social self, it's not what we're all in tonight, but that it's deep down in us, and that's what's released at physical death.
When you're saying strange things happen, what kinds of things?
Well, historically, the theory is that the belief in a soul originated with people dreaming or seeing their loved one after he or she had passed. And that, of course, implies that they still exist. The assumption in the anthropological literature in the 19th century was that establishes that it's just a dream or it's just an illusion. But what we see in the literature as well, including today, is that this really does happen to people all the time. And the people to whom it happens are absolutely convinced that it's not just an illusion or just a hallucination. So it looks like that this is sort of the origin of the belief in a soul. And of course, that's the key issue here, really, at the end of the day. My own position on this is very close to Allan's with this notion of diversity. I think really there are two elephants in the living room here, or in this room. One is science, and on some level, I think modern people are convinced that mind or consciousness or soul is simply an epiphenomenon of the brain. And so what that means, if that's true, then death is the end of the soul or the person, just like you switch off a light. So there's that sort of scientific challenge to this traditional notion of a separable soul. On the religious side, I think maybe what Allan was getting at, and certainly what I want to get at, it's not just a matter of faith or no faith, it's really also a matter of too many faiths. And what I mean by that, I grew up in a farming community in Nebraska in the 1970s, where the notion of religious diversity, everybody was German, and so it boiled down to whether you were Lutheran or Catholic. That was the extent of the diversity. Now, in that world, when people die, there's a standard narrative that everyone pretty much buys into. Even if though they doubt it, it's the cultural narrative. And we know what a funeral looks like, and we know what happens to the soul after it dies. We know to go have a mass said for the person. If you're Catholic or if you're Lutheran, you do something else. But it's pretty straightforward, and it's frankly comforting, and it works to help that community through that loss. That's no longer the case in the modern sort of urban world. I live in Houston, and there is no standard narrative. If a doctor's going to walk through a modern hospital, he's going to move through a couple dozen worldviews in a single day, and they're going to have radically different belief systems around what happens in the death process. And I think a lot of folks in the modern world, and I put myself here clearly, is to the extent we grant humanity and integrity to other people and to other cultures and to other communities, we have to be asking on some level, well, who's right?
Well, Lani, let me bring you back into this. I mean, you have all this experience with people in their final stages. And we should make a distinction here between, we're talking about people dying from illness rather than sudden deaths.
Illness or age.
Yes.
And 90% of all people, 90% of the people in the United States will die from an age-related or an illness. 10% of us will die from sudden, unexpected death.
So following up on what Jeff has just said, I mean, do people talk about this kind of thing in your conversations with them? I mean, sort of these more spiritual questions?
I think if we ask open questions, it invites that. And my experience sitting with people who are dying is when I ask them, have you had any contact with a deceased loved one? Their response is, finally, someone is asking me. When I did research at the National Institute of Health, and I worked with children who were dying of AIDS, and I sat with a child who was dying and had 3 other friends who had predeceased him, and he looked up at the ceiling and said, Johnny and Timmy and Sally. I said to the nurse, go get his parents. And when the parents came, the child died soon afterwards. And when I started interviewing parents about, have you had any contact with your deceased child, the response was, thank God someone is asking me this. Now, nobody else, my supervisors didn't want me to ask this stuff, but across the board, it was the most comforting exchange that they had had, because they needed validation of something that was clearly important to them, that created meaning around this tragedy, that changed their experience of their child's death.
What do you make of those? I mean, when people start saying, I see Johnny and Sally, what?
Well, I've had my own personal near-death experience, and my experience is that it happens, and they're as close as right here. But it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what they're doing with their experience, and how we help, how we support them in making meaning. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter whether I prove it or not. But I've had thousands and thousands of people tell me the same story over and over again. And Tahiti didn't used to be on the map. And if we had described Tahiti before in these terms, the explorers would have been called crazy. After thousands of people went to Tahiti with exactly the same description of the people and the language, Tahiti's on the map.
So, Allan, you have also talked with people in the final stages.
Yeah.
Have you found that belief or lack of belief in the afterlife is fundamental?
Fundamental.
Fundamental in terms of how they approach death?
My experience reflects some of the recent studies on the role of religion in relation to dying people, which is that it doesn't really matter what your belief is, as long as you believe it deeply. So if you're a religious person and you really do believe it deeply, that helps. That is a comfort. As indeed if you're an atheist and you're secular, if you're committed to that, that provides its own consolation. It's the people in the middle that's the problem, which is actually probably the vast majority.
I was going to say, that's pretty much everybody. Yeah.
And that's, we were talking earlier about the anxiety and some of the fear. And I think for most people, their religious beliefs are lightly handled. And in a crisis, that becomes a problem.
Explain why an atheist who is sure that it just all ends when they die, that's a source of comfort, whereas the people in the middle who are not exactly sure, why that would cause more anxiety.
Well, I mean, I think that quite a lot of people who are humanists and rationalists, who believe that when they die, that's it, they're worm fodder, are people who, and particularly if they can expect death, more think about the people they leave behind and the legacy that they've left behind, the work they do. They think much more about that, I think, than quite a lot of people who just sort of bumble along and think, well, I've got another 10 years, I've got another 20, I've got another 30. And I think that people who are genuinely and deeply committed to the idea that this life is the only life and that's the end of it, do seem to me, when I talk to them anyway, take some comfort from doing the preparations, leaving behind supports for the people that they love, and think much more about the existential contribution made by their work life, for example, or their art, or their music, whatever it is that they're doing.